Online. E você já pode enviar daquele jeito que você fez, certo? Vou conferir aqui.
Yeah, it is. Let me just try to. Here we go. Okay. Bom dia a todos. Obrigado novamente pela presença. Nós começamos então o nosso terceiro dia, hoje com a conferência da professora Juliet Floyd, e depois passaremos aos comentários do professor Mal. Eu vou agora apresentá-los propriamente em inglês. Well, good morning, you all. Welcome to our third session. This morning, with the conference by Professor Juliet Floyd. Professor Juliet Floyd has such an amazing curriculum. She is the Gordon Parker Bound Professor of Philosophy and Director of the Boston University Center for the Humanities. And today we will have the comments by Professor Mauro Engelmann from the Federal University of Minas Gerais. Professor Juliet, thank you so very much for being with us now in person. And please, I'll give it the floor.
Obrigada. Shall I? Maybe I use this.
If you prefer, it's up to
mic.
you.
Can people hear me? This is okay?
It's up to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Gabriel. I first want to say what an honor and a pleasure it is to be here. I'm incredibly grateful for all the work that I know goes into bringing someone all the way from Boston here. I've learned an enormous amount already at the conference. It's a great research group. And I just wanted to thank everyone, including the students, for all the work. It's been flawlessly presented, obviously, this group. Is it better?
Yeah, the battery. No, just because of battery.
Oh, okay. Is this on? So, thanks to everyone. The research group is fantastic, and I hope to come back again. And some of what I say today will connect with some of the other talks we've heard. We know that Gottfried Gabriel began in talking about the tradition in German 19th century philosophy to Frege, from Herder and others. Frege saw a difficulty in thinking that language always mirrors the structure of thought. And what Professor Gabriel said is, language is anthropological for Frege. So in Wittgenstein, we see this point reinforced. In a way, it's a development of Frege, as I see it. I think Frege was enormously important for Wittgenstein. But Wittgenstein deepens the significance of this anthropological term. And I'm very happy that Mauro Engelmann and I, we talk a lot, so we'll just continue this conversation and share with people. He's written a wonderful book about the anthropological elements of Wittgenstein's philosophy. But I've been working on Wittgenstein's philosophy of mathematics, so I have a serious problem about what to do with this part of his work. And I will be getting to issues about freedom and necessity, so connecting perhaps with some of the roots. It's not a metaphysical problem for Wittgenstein, but it is a problem relative to the notion of logical necessity. So we'll be getting back to that as well. And ultimately, we'll get to culture. So that will bring us back to our discussion of yesterday and some of the discussion around Susan Gabriel's talk about the nature of philosophy and the role that it plays in culture. Okay, let's go 2 slides up to Wittgenstein's anthropological turn. So in my mind, 1937 is a very crucial date in Wittgenstein's development. There were important things before, and in some sense, the whole career is in its entirety a unity. There are remarks in the Tractatus that have an anthropological ring, that, human language is as complicated as the human organism, that colloquial language is in order just as it is, that the Bildhaftigkeit, the capacity of our language to represent lies behind all our ability to draw analogies and similes, some of these issues about poetry and propositional thought that Professor Gabriel was dealing with. However, 37, there is an intensification of this, and it's very important for Wittgenstein's work on remarks on the logical must and on the foundations of mathematics, because it's not till the spring of 1937 that the concept of Regelmäßigkeit becomes a very intense focus. So there are echoes of the rule-following issue in earlier work. This is something Professor Engelmann emphasizes in his book. Wittgenstein does think you have a problem if you think the way you account for a person following a rule is throwing a mental state at the problem. This is the anti-psychologismus. But Regelmäßigkeit as a concept is not really worked through till 1937. So I will make a big deal about that. For me, it was the impact of Turing's 1936 paper, which Turing sent to Wittgenstein, I think not by his mother, but there's a letter to his mother where he says, I've sent it to Wittgenstein by the spring of 37. When Wittgenstein is up in Norway, he gets his hands on that paper. I think he had heard about the result that Turing got already in the summer of 36, just before he left Cambridge to go up to Norway to attempt to turn the Brown book into a book. And he miserably failed. And very famously, he had a terrible time in November. It was all dark. He was praying. It was very difficult. And then he sits down and begins in November philosophical investigation. So it's a very dramatic period where Wittgenstein breaks through to his later highly interlocutory polyphonic style of writing. And that for me is deeply connected with Regelmäßigkeit and the things I'll talk about today. Finally, I do think we need to make sense of this anthropological turn he takes in response to all of these issues. Okay, we can go next. So here's the kind of remark I have in mind. Now, this one's from 1929, so it's middle Wittgenstein, long before. He says, there is no religious denomination in which so much sin has been committed through the misuse of metaphorical expressions as in mathematics. Okay, so what is he talking about? This is an early place where he accuses Cantor and Hilbert of, in England, we would say, sexing up the dossier. So there's the diagonal argument of Cantor. I'm going to assume most people have seen that. We could discuss after. You list all of the countable sequences of numbers, and then you go down the diagonal and you change each digit when you hit the diagonal. And now you've created a new sequence. But if you add that sequence to the list, you can create another diagonal number. So the procedure goes on and on. And this is Cantor's diagonal argument that there is not a 1-1 correlation between the size of the natural numbers and the size of the real numbers. But there's a lot of sexing up the dossier. Hilbert talks about the paradise, which has been opened up to us with the higher infinite. And Wittgenstein doesn't like this. What he's thinking here is sort of anthropological, that a lot of what mathematicians say, and perhaps scientists too, is filled with magical thinking. And I invite you to think about a lot of the things coming out of Silicon Valley right now about AI. One of the reasons Alan Turing went on the BBC in the 1950s was because there was an equal amount of hysteria. Lord Mountbatten had talked about an electronic brain that had been built. And the public, of course, given nuclear weapons having been dropped on Japan, panicked. So Turing was trying to calm people down. And we're in a somewhat similar time now. So this is how we get into culture and what the importance of philosophy is and the humanities in terms of dealing with magical thinking. So Wittgenstein has this idea that misleading metaphors must be resisted and worked through. In Malraux's book, he points out that for Weismann, this was sort of the central point of the nature of philosophy for the middle Wittgenstein. Things expand, I think, a bit as Wittgenstein goes forward, but still, this remains a theme. And the anthropological tone or the anthropological turn here is intended to give us a sort of ethnography of ourselves. It's supposed to be self-critical. It's not that Wittgenstein is putting himself apart from Cantor and Hilbert. they are part of Wittgenstein's own culture. So I think he regards this as anthropology where you bring the alien being home. Okay, we can go to the next. So here's his diagnosis now in 1938 to 39, later on, of this problem. If it were said, consideration of the diagonal procedure shows you that the concept real number has much less analogy with the concept cardinal number than we, being misled by certain analogies, are inclined to believe, that would have a good and honest sense. Okay, so that's a moral remark. But just the opposite happens. One pretends to compare the set of real numbers in magnitude with that of cardinal numbers. The difference in kind between the two conceptions is represented by a skew form of expression, as a difference of extension. I believe and hope that a future generation will laugh at this hocus pocus. So again, it's magic. Now, I would like to say that, Wittgenstein is very harsh on set theory. And set theory is a beautiful part of math. So we have to take into account that sometimes in his notebooks, he's getting very excited. And I don't know about you, but sometimes in my journals, I write down things that are, cursing people. Some of his work, it was not intended for publication. So we have to take this into account. Nevertheless, there is something that he's getting at here, and I want to say that it has to do exactly with Cantor's diagonal argument. There are two ways of glossing that result that Cantor gives us. One way is what I'll call the non-extensional way. I'm not going to call it intentional because I don't think Wittgenstein has a notion of intention that is very clear. But let's call it non-extensional. Well, what does the Cantor proof do? It's a completely finitistic and computable procedure, right? You write down these sequences and then you. So what you could regard the result as being is just that there's a fruitful way of producing a new sequence. We have a kind of positive situation. Wittgenstein doesn't mind that at all. And in fact, there were earlier diagonal arguments using those methods in the textbooks of Turing's and Wittgenstein's day. But what happens in Cantor is Cantor wants to bring actually infinite objects into mathematical reasoning. And if you're going to do that, you have to complete the infinite. And you must go to the notion of an extension, which is a set, which has elements with no order. You have to, in other words, completely erase all human procedures or all discussions of rules or all discussions of computations, or you can't have the notion of an actually infinite object. So there's a necessity to the way Cantor glosses his argument. We get to the point where there's not a 1-1 correlation between completed sets. However, what happens is that the extensionalist then starts saying, this is the ultimately correct way of reading the proof, and there's no other way of proving it. So that's what Wittgenstein means by a skew form of expression. For Wittgenstein, there's a tension, a beautiful tension, and other mathematicians would talk about this, a tension between this procedural way of thinking about calculation rules and the extensional way. And the thing you should do is admit the tension and admit that it's a big jump to go to Cantor. If you admit that, then Wittgenstein is okay with that. So I don't read Wittgenstein as a constructivist in a sort of ideological sense. I don't think he's saying set theory is meaningless, but he is saying there are two very different ways of viewing this. And the idea that it's an undifferentiated change is a huge mistake. And that involves you in talking about magical things like the paradise of Hilbert and so on and so forth. Finally, I do want to say set theory, although it's a beautiful branch of mathematics, Wittgenstein's prediction is correct. Set theory is pushed aside from most math departments around the world. What's happened is that the computational finitistic paradigm has taken over. So now we have departments of math and statistics. That's where it begins, at least in the United States. And then you begin to get away from the idea that, from the 1960s when I was young, that mathematics is about conceptual articulation and it has philosophical aspects. No. Now the teaching of mathematics has gone into schools of data science. they have no use for set theory. And they're not hiring people to teach set theory. Set theory is retreating, however beautiful it is, and I live in the same city as Hugh Wooden, who's the greatest set theorist in the world. It's retreating into institutes. So it's part of culture. And Wittgenstein's prediction is perhaps there's something to that. Okay. Here we have the sickness of a time is cured by an alteration in the mode of life of human beings, and it was possible for the sickness of philosophical problems to get cured only through a changed mode of thought and life, not through medicine invented by an individual. So a medicine invented by an individual would be, let's say, Wittgenstein's philosophy. He's not thinking that he can change the culture with some method or some philosophical argument. There's a whole way of life that has to change to have any substantial curing of illnesses. And the later Wittgenstein does not overestimate his distance from the culture or his ability to change the culture. Then he says, think of the use of the motor car producing or encouraging certain sicknesses, and mankind being plagued by such sickness until, from some cause or other, as the result of some development or other, it abandons the high habit of driving. Again, I don't know about new transportation systems and driverless cars, but in any case, you see the analogy and notice that it's a question here, not so much of philosophy from on high telling us what to do. It's a question of philosophy helping us with a change in our way of living, in our form of life. And notice also the idea of technique, the idea of technology. Now, in German, the word technique means both technique and technology, so we have to bear that in mind. Okay, next slide. Here, I realized, partly reading this, writing my paper, that I simply have to talk about Spengler, because these ideas about the sickness of this time, about the disappearance of culture, these are very much part of Wittgenstein's generation in the 1920s, and in particular, the role of mathematics in expressing the decline of a culture is very Spenglerian, and the notion of technique. So I'm just going to say a few things about this. So in The Decline of the West, we read, the means whereby to identify dead forms is mathematical law. The means whereby to understand living forms is analogy. So the idea is that mathematics distills the essence of a culture, indexing its decline into a dying, rigid civilization. I'm suggesting that those schools of data science and statistics are expressing the deadness of certain forms of civilization. Now, for Spengler, in modernity, humans have enslaved themselves to the technology. They do the devil's work of the machine. And he's particularly hostile toward engineers. Of course, Wittgenstein was trained as an engineer. Things become merely technical, a mere matter of technique. Analogy is required to begin a new culture. However, he's clear that primitive man, he calls it primitive man, and children have no Kultursprache because they lack the capacity of self-expression. So for Spengler, what you need to do is to look at the development of high culture in an organic form. And then you will see, it's like the flowers, the sunflowers turn, they have their height and then they decline, and then something new is born, and we have this sort of schema over and over again. Now, Wittgenstein certainly never accepted the idea that there's a necessity to history, but I think he resonated with certain elements of Spengler. And we could see him in his later work trying to show that logic and mathematics should not be dead or cultish. They should be living and expressive, but also very human and localized. And his word that he uses sometimes is Hausgebacken. So you have to make mathematics, including diagonal argument, Hausgebacken. Here are some more, let's go to the next slide. Yes, Spenglerian echoes at Cambridge in his 1930s lectures. The British students were always asking Wittgenstein, do you believe Spengler? Do you believe in the decline of civilization? And Wittgenstein would say no. But here we see some remarks that, again, echo the Spengler. There have been great philosophers, but now for the first time there can be skillful ones. So I think he's identifying with this. Somehow, he's, of course, very ambivalent. He's trying to be a great philosopher, and let's say he was one. But anyway, he's thinking that now we have skillful philosophers. This doesn't mean that progress has occurred, that's Spenglerian, but the style of thinking has changed. The nimbus of philosophy has been lost. And this is what we were talking about during the session after Susan's paper, the nimbus. For example, an architect has a nimbus compared to an engineer. Of course, Wittgenstein would pursue architecture. The general tendency of this age is to take away possibilities of expression, which is characteristic of an age without culture. So Wittgenstein, in a sense, agrees with Spengler that there is no culture. Culture is dead. You know, we have the modern press. This is Karl Kraus. All these things in Wittgenstein's cultural background. You know, it's gone. There's all this moralizing about what we should do. It's just empty. The press manufactures all sorts of crazy ideas. And basically the growth of nonsense, to use a sort of Wittgensteinian term to this, nonsense becomes a growth field, as I would say it is now. I would say nonsense is a very important area of research right now. So, but he does think it's an age without culture. So part of the issue is to work through the notion of culture so that you kind of get rid of this Spenglerian idea, the old idea of somehow high culture is a full organic expression of a time. Now, he doesn't respond to Spengler with a dogmatic commitment to scientific progress, but if you read Neurath's essay, Anti-Spengler, of course, this is where he talks about the boat, we're on the boat, we repaired the boat at sea, and so on. That's the idea that, oh, Spengler, you know, he's just too pessimistic. We can use science to fix our problems. Wittgenstein doesn't take that tack, although, of course, he's influenced by the Vienna Circle and their appropriation of his early work. Instead, he anthropologizes what he calls the beginnings of mathematics and the image of the machine. And the idea, as I say, is to take this notion of technique and twist it into making it something hausgebackene, that is subject to human mastery and technique. So he miniaturizes, domesticates, and reassembles into very small parts what Spengler called the machine technique of modernity. And again, he doesn't think Wittgenstein, he wants to get rid of the idea that there's a grand, orchestrated, necessary schema to history. I mean, progress looks greater than it is also is supposed to mean. Progress, the whole idea of progress has filled with traps where we think we can predict what will happen or that we discern some underlying pattern. Now, it's crucial to see that logic itself, during Wittgenstein's life, demonstrated from within itself that there is not just one super hard mechanism of logic. And that's the results of Gödel and Turing, of course, showing that in general, logic is not decidable. There's not one algorithm. So this, for Wittgenstein, intersects with the idea that the role of mathematics in culture must be reassessed. And just to tell you that, you know, Hilbert, the great Hilbert, also echoes some Spenglerian elements. Here's Hilbert in 1930. The instrument which mediates between theory and practice, between thought and observation, is mathematics. It builds the connecting bridges and makes them ever sounder. Thus it happens that our entire modern culture, insofar as it rests on the penetration and utilization of nature, has its foundation in mathematics. So here's Hilbert waxing cultural about mathematics. And Wittgenstein, in his later writings, will contrast the notion of a Grundlegung, a working through of the metaphors of what a foundation is, with the idea of giving a foundation, or a Grundlagen in Frege's sense. So there's a wonderful remark, is the painted rock a foundation of the painted tower? Well, of course, in one sense, in the picture, the painted rock is the foundation of the tower, and the whole rock is the foundation of the representation. But it's not like this notion of foundation doesn't have magical hocus pocus properties in the hands of Hilbert. Now, a crucial point of reference for these notions that Gödel and Turing are working with is metamathematics. And here's Hilbert in 1927. Here, proof, in his proof theory with formalized proofs, is carried out according to certain definite rules in which the technique of our thinking, the Technik unseres Denkens, we'll come back to that, is expressed. These rules form a closed system that can be discovered and definitively stated. The fundamental idea of my proof theory is none other than to describe the activity of our understanding, to make a protocol of the rules according to which our thinking actually proceeds. Thinking, it so happens, parallels speaking and writing. This, of course, Frege, this was the topic of Gottfried Gabriel's lecture. Thinking, it so happens, parallels speaking and writing. We form statements and place them one behind the other. If any totality of observations and phenomena deserves to be made the object of a serious and thorough investigation, it is this one. Since, after all, it is part of the task of science to liberate us from the arbitrariness, sentiment, and habit, and to protect us from the subjectivism that already made itself felt in Kroneker's views, and it seems to me finds its culmination in intuitionism. Now, the 20s is a very political time, and so Hilbert finds himself in this battle with Brouwer. Brouwer did not want to use the law of the excluded middle in infinite contexts. Brouwer was interested in a very different view of what mathematics was really about. Kroneker was famous for having said, God made the integers and the rest is the work of human beings. So Hilbert doesn't like this, and he's up on the ramparts. He's going to use his proof theory to get rid of arbitrariness and sentiment. Okay, so feeling, culture, all that kind of stuff. And Wittgenstein, in discussions with the Vienna Circle, emphasizes we need to tone this down. Metamathematics is just more mathematics. That's fine, but that's what it is. It's not some kind of huge Grundlagen that will save us. There's a remark about Ramsey that's very important here that makes itself, without Ramsey's name, into the investigations. Wittgenstein went back to Cambridge, and Ramsey was writing things about the Bolshevism of Brouwer. Again, very political. Wittgenstein talked with Ramsey, argued with him, and then said, Ramsey's a bourgeois thinker. And he's playing on this whole idea. He says what he wants to do is to shore up the foundations of our current state. And Wittgenstein says, but I want to look at the foundations of all possible states. So Ramsey is a bourgeois thinker, and I guess Wittgenstein is not supposed to be. But anyway, bürgerlich. So here's Wittgenstein on metamathematics in 1930, again, middle Wittgenstein. The methods of the newer mathematical logicians are reminiscent, I believe, of the methods of the current experimental psychologists. In both, something specific is being done, but both are wrong about the meaning and scope of their work. The tests of intelligence, presence of mind, and so on do test something, but not what we call presence of mind and intelligence. And the proofs of consistency probably show something, but nothing important. At least that's what I think. They always crawl around on the surface of the questions, and they don't see what's actually important. But once the actual work has been done, many of these external games are obsolete or have to be completely reinterpreted. Again, here's a lot of technology and no thought or spirit. So the idea, I guess, is that the living, ordinary place of our discussions of states of mind, intelligence, presence of mind, that's where the real action is. Then you could have psychological experiments that try to correlate various things, but those don't supersede the understanding that we have at the basic level of life, of, if you like, the subjective. And this would be true also of metamathematics. Metamathematics is okay in its place. It draws out a certain aspect. We could call it the finitistic aspect of step-by-step proof that can be checked. But there's no interest to proof theory if we weren't teaching our children mathematics and working with mathematics in other contexts. Okay, so now in 1944, we see something slightly different, importantly different. Only through a human mastery of technique can we grasp a regelmäßigkeit. So here he seems to be saying that only if we can master this concept of technique can we make sense of the notion of following a rule, which after all is an everyday notion. It's not only a notion in logic. So it's the same idea. We've got to look at the ordinary home of rule following in order to understand what Hilbert is doing and put it in its place. But here, he brings the notion of technique squarely into his understanding. So there's a kind of textual puzzle, which is where I started in thinking about this paper, which is what's the relation or distinction between the notions of practice and technique, praxis und Technik. Praxis appears far less frequently in philosophical investigations. Technique appears much more often. And in particular, technique appears 117 times in the transcripts of Wittgenstein's 1939 lectures at Cambridge, which Turing attended. So he's really bringing that notion in 1937 onward, and 1939 in particular, and working through it with Turing and his students. And for Turing, actually, the notion of technique turns out to be a very important notion that he uses by the by. So my proposal is to try to examine Wittgenstein's evolution with this distinction between praxis and technique from 1936 to 44 to understand the development of his later philosophy, but also in light of his development in philosophy of logic and math. So praxis and technique do play this very distinctive role. And I think what's happening is that the notion of technique is brought in and thematized in order to sophisticate the idea that meaning arises in the practice of language. So it's not enough to say meaning arises in the practice of language for the later Wittgenstein. What he wants to emphasize is the fact that there are a variety of techniques for embedding symbols and forms of life within practices that really shapes at the most fundamental level our notions of rule following and Regelmäßigkeit. So his anthropological turn, which is radicalized in his remarks on the beginnings of mathematics and logic, deepens his response to Spengler's and Fraser's philosophies of culture, and it also shapes his mature responses to the mathematical logicians. So rule following, Regelmäßigkeit, really becomes the focus in the spring of 37. Now, very famously, Saul Kripke linked Wittgenstein's idea of a practice to the idea of social consensus and the extrusion of private language. So for Kripke, it's kind of a Humean reading of Wittgenstein, that somehow we refuse to accept the child who wants to carry the series on in a different way. We force a certain kind of social consensus. Now, in terms of the notion of practice, Rawls characterizes a practice in terms of the rules that constitute it. This is a view I think Wittgenstein is questioning in the later philosophy. Now, others have said that the notion of praxis is supposed to distinguish itself from Theorie. This is, of course, very important in the German tradition, praxis and Theorie. And other people have joined the notion of a practice to conventionalism, normativity, this vague notion of normativity, incommensurability, or so on. But for the mature Wittgenstein, I want to emphasize, at least after 1936, a practice always already involves the practitioners in disputes, understandings, and alternative routes of proceeding, the mastery of a variety of differing techniques. So the notion of practice does not get us as far as we need to go with the idea of meaning as use. Okay. Here from 1939 in part 3 of Remarks on the Foundations of Mathematics, Wittgenstein says, I'd like to say mathematics is a colorful mix. He says, buntes Gemisch. Anscombe translate that as motley. And in the French translation, they pick that up and they say bigarré, like a jester's costume or something. But actually, Wittgenstein doesn't. Buntes Gemisch just means a colorful mix of techniques of proof. And upon this is based its manifold applicability and its importance. So there are a couple of things here. To go back to Cantor as an example, the extensionalist reading of Cantor's argument is fine, but what it does is to obscure and erase the everyday techniques we have with particular real numbers like pi and e and the square root of 2. So it goes away from those entirely and obscures them by adopting an extensionalist point of view. But then it seems to say, well, then those things aren't of any importance. Secondly, proofs have to be humanly surveyable. And I like that translation. I noticed that you use that translation too for the later Wittgenstein. Sometimes Übersichtlichkeit is translated as a bird's eye view, or somehow you can take it in at a glance or something like that. I don't think that's what Wittgenstein. It's not a visual criterion of something being a proof. Instead, it's that you can survey it, you can communicate it, and I would say, most importantly, you can reproduce a proof without loss. So this is the problem with ChatGPT and these black boxes of the LLMs. They don't have Übersichtlichkeit in the Hilbertian sense. You run the thing, and there's no way of seeing what's going on. So it's not Übersichtlich. It's not proof. We're not in the realm of that concept. So Wittgenstein's point in part 3 of remarks is to say, look, we may use formalized proofs for a variety of reasons, and it might be extremely important, particularly for engineering or even conceptually, that you can write down any proof using the language of Principia Mathematica or Hilbert's proof. The fact that you can always do that is a remarkable thing. On the other hand, in order to understand and take in the formal proof, we use ordinary language. We count the number of parentheses that are written down. We talk with one another using metaphors. I teach logic all the time, so I'm very, very aware of this. I mean, you have to still use ordinary language. So this is a very fundamental point. I would say it's a fundamental point for Quine, by the way, if you understand his philosophy of logic, it's the same. So you don't need to see the formal proof as somehow a foundation of the whole tower. It's something else. And here's a remark from 47-48 about use. One can talk about the function of the word in the sentence, in the language game, in the language, but function in each of these cases means technique, and therefore refers to a general explanation and training. I'll try to say something about the generality here, but certainly techniques are passed on from one person to the other. There's no such thing as a technique that can't be taught. And there's no such thing as a technique which can only be used once. A technique is not a trick. So mathematicians will sometimes, if there's a very interesting move made in a proof, they will talk about a trick, Scott's trick, because they see something pulled out of nowhere. Soon, however, once further study goes on, sometimes Scott's trick becomes not just a trick, it's a technique that you always use in order to prove certain kinds of things. Now here's the investigations. 199. It's not possible that there should have been only one occasion on which only one person followed a rule. It's not possible that there should have been only one occasion on which a report was made, and order was given or understood, and so on. To follow a rule, to make a report, to give an order, to play a game of chess are customs or institutions. And now we see a very interesting remark. To understand a sentence means to understand a language. To understand a language means to have mastered a technique. Now that remark is a little bit bad because it makes it seem too pat. So Wittgenstein has to, as usual, come back and take it back a little bit. But you can see how the notion of technique is reducing down what's the most fundamental notion, and it's going to be the notion of technique. It's got to bring that in. Okay, so here are some suggestions. Technique does more heavy lifting for the later Wittgenstein than praxis. Technique involves the reproducibility of a routine. It portrays language as exhibiting a variety of differing elements fitted together creatively in a variety of ways for varieties of purposes. Techniques are robust, non-extensional, by the way, ways of regarding logic and numbers in mathematics. So we have the technique of long division. We have various techniques you would use to divide numbers or to calculate. Techniques are targeted in their spheres of application. For example, the diagonal argumentation. And praxis, by contrast, is there to emphasize, in contrast, the theory, that the speaking of language is an activity whose structure is representable in terms of a variety of rules. And this is a move, I would say, against Rawls's notion of a practice in that early paper, Two Concepts of Rules, Wittgenstein will emphasize in the investigation for any praxis, this is part of the anthropological point, there could be a number of different rules used to reconstruct the behavior of a given individual. For me, deeply connected with Klein on the indeterminacy of translation, but that's another lecture. So what's new in 36 to 39? First, there is this mature interlocutory style. That's not true of the Blue Book and the Brown Book. And I don't think it's just literary. I think actually it reflects a necessity, because logic itself will be involved in broken lines of thinking. So the literary style is both very beautiful, very poetic, of course. Wittgenstein loved that. That was important. But it's also showing you the nature of logos. And the nature of logos is not about putting one sentence behind another and having a nice, orderly, formal structure. It's something else. So, in particular, any analysis or any division of human behavior into simple parts, every single one of those is contestable. They might be successful within a certain context, but each can be questioned. So you still have analysis, I think, for the later Wittgenstein, but his view of analysis is very dynamic and very open-ended. The concerted focus on the idea of following a rule. When Wittgenstein in 1936 puts in the remarks about Pleios with the colored squares, and he says, here's a language game where we could line up colored squares. That's the first place where he writes down, but what does it mean to say that these names have meaning only in the context of a language or use? What does that mean? So he's never asked in the Blue or the Brown Book what meaning is the use means. Now he's going to actually focus on that. He says in the preface to the investigations that he used to think logic had a certain kind of formal unity, but now he realizes that's not true. It doesn't have a formal unity, and I'll get back to Turing in a moment, but this is absolutely true. So he realizes he can't write a book that is gap-free, Lückenlose. This is a reference, of course, to the Begriffsschrift of Frege. So in the preface of the investigations, we see a reference back to Frege's term, the whole idea of gap-free proofs. Wittgenstein has given up on that ideal. By the way, an objection I have to the Hacker-Schulte translation, new translation into English, of the investigation says, Hacker doesn't want any connection with Frege, so he translates Lückenlose as coarse. And that's just, no, racist. Anyway, a very interesting point is that it's not until the fall of 36 that the notion of a form of life enters Wittgenstein's thinking. And it's very dramatic. He's getting to the end, and he's up there trying to revise the Brown Book into a book. It's not going very well. And he takes the word Kultur and he crosses out Kultur and he puts Lebensform in its place. So Lebensform is a substitute for the notion of culture. And from that point on, he never uses the word Kultur again in the investigations. So this is no accident, of course. This I'm interpreting as a Spenglerianly appropriate thing. He's writing a book, finishing the manuscript in 1945. I mean, there is not Kultur. And it's not obvious that there will be Kultur. What you have to do is to instead address philosophy to detailed issues in our forms of life. So this again goes back to the discussion about what we do in philosophy. But Kultur now, this German idea of the organic whole or high culture that could be used to somehow orient a nation and so on, it's out. That's no accident. Technique, on the other hand, he brings in to remarks on the foundations of mathematics. So it's all over the place. It occurs everywhere. Okay, so I'll just say a few things about the notion of forms of life as I read it in light of all of this. Forms of life, I think, are not just phenomenological. I think Wittgenstein never uses the term Lebenswelt. That's got to be intentional. Okay. Now, why? Because there is a certain phenomenological aspect, obviously, to what Wittgenstein is doing. But the idea here would be that life worlds are already meaningful, culturally saturated forms and holistic norms of living that already have meaning. So this would be Heidegger and, being in time, Dasein with the hammer. There's kind of a meaningful whole context. The Investigations is written, it's not obvious there is any meaningful context. So you have to earn it. And so forms of life are playing that kind of different role. They evolve piecemeal. We sort of stitch together, we knit affiliations. Certain universal aspects of human life, forms of life, are sort of universal. That we chat, that we have hands, that we grieve, that we play, that we smile at babies, that we call things by their names. Those are kind of roughly universal aspects. But forms of life are also highly specific in enculturated possibilities of structuring lives with language. And one reason that I think of the Investigations is still logic is Wittgenstein's never writing about what is the case. He only writes about possibilities. That's very important. It's always about form in that sense. He's not saying that he's describing what is. He's not saying that he knows what those forms of life are. Instead, form is, to quote the Tractatus, the possibility of structure. So you have to have some kind of space in which significance can appear. And all he ever does in philosophy is to work through possibilities. That would be sort of the strict way of seeing this anthropological point. Finally, forms of life, and I'm going to get criticized for this, they require the first person, the I. So back to Susan's talk with the objective and the subjective. I think it's very clear that every practice that uses techniques requires one by one for each one of us to situate ourselves in that ongoing routine. And this comes out in the rule following remarks with the child who refuses to go on 2, 4, 6, 8, but develops a new series. In the Blue and the Brown book, the child is excluded and treated like an idiot. Wittgenstein takes that out of the Investigations. So that's another index of the change. Actually, you might praise the child for doing something highly creative and original. And that's internal to the notion of following a rule, or at least this is what I think he is trying to say. So, this anthropological turn, Wittgenstein is not beginning with Kant's philosophical question, what is a human being, and in a sense, using philosophy to orient anthropology. Rather, he's exploring these possibilities of forms of life, given how things are. So, by way of this investigation, we learn about ourselves. Philosophizing about logic and mathematics can learn from this anthropological point of view without reducing the necessity of logic to anthropology. Now, in order to make this out, I'm going to skip this next slide and let's go to, how are we doing for time?
No, it's absolutely okay.
Gosh, it's not okay. I'm actually really behind.
Ah.
Let's skip these. I have some quotations using the notion of technique and remarks on the foundations of math. But let's go to the second occurrence here. So this is the second occurrence of technique in part 1 of Remarks on the Foundations of Math, which was part of the original version of Philosophical Investigations. The propositions of logic are laws of thought, use that quote of a famous idea from Kant onward, because they express the essence of human thought, but more correctly because they express or show the essence or the technique, Watson, of thinking. They show what thinking is and also ways of thinking. So laws of thought alludes, of course, to Kant and Frege. Frege, in the preface to the Grundgesetze, they're not psychological laws, but boundary stones set in an eternal foundation, which our thought can overflow but never dislodge. So Wittgenstein is responding to this. And to put this very briefly, I think what he's saying to Frege is, if you want it, if you want eternal boundary stones, you're going to have to take into account forms of life, the friction in everyday life. Otherwise, you can't have what you want, Frege. So that's what makes Wittgenstein a radical but deep developer of Frege, actually. The technique of thinking we've seen in Hilbert. The formulaic game is carried out according to certain definite rules. So Wittgenstein is in certain way tipping toward Hilbert. He's sort of agreeing that logic involves the technique of our thinking. But then he alludes to Watson. Alistair Watson was the person who introduced him to Turing. And Watson was at the 39 lectures. And they discussed the nature of logic in great detail in 1937. So what he gets from Watson and Turing is that there are ways of thinking. There's a variety of techniques. And that's endemic to the protocol of our laws of thought. Okay. I'm not going to read through this. Is this typical? Imagine someone so bewitched so that he calculated that 4 times 3 plus 2 equals 10. And then Wittgenstein finds a way of making sense of that. Because if I'm handing around, stones to people, I just hand one to Mauro and take it away, and then I move on to the next person. And you could play a game where that made perfect sense. Okay, but let's go on. I have to say a few words about Turing and then close. So I hope we have time for that. This is a little bit technical, but for me it's very important because it shows how rigorous Wittgenstein is in thinking about the nature of logic. It's not just that, ordinary language is better than formalized language and science is bad. No, what he's fascinated by is that it's from within the Hilbertian project that you suddenly can see the limits of that project. It limited itself. And this he finds very persuasive. And this I find also is part of the rigor of Wittgenstein's own anthropological turn. So the first thing I have to say, and I've written a lot of papers on this, so I'm just not going to argue, I'll just say what I think. Turing's most important paper on computable numbers, which gives us the scientific analysis of the notion of computation. So, he's one of the greatest scientists of the last 500 years, whether we like it or not. His greatest paper, which I think Turing thought of as his greatest paper, that turns on Wittgenstein's method of language games. It is anthropological at the basis. In the bad old days, people read Turing as a mechanist about the mind, including my beloved teacher, Hilary Putnam, as some kind of mechanist about the mind with functionalism and all these things. Hilary was at MIT hanging out with the engineers. But actually, I think this emphasis on philosophy of mind is wrong. It's misplaced. Really, Turing is a philosopher of logic. And even though there's great biography of Turing by Andrew Hodges, great literature on Turing, very substantial literature, I was amazed in beginning to work on Turing and how little on logic and philosophy people appreciated he knew. He knew a lot. In fact, I would go so far as to say we would not have the Turing machine if it weren't for philosophy and if he hadn't read the Blue Book. So I will just say that as an aside. Okay. Here's the kind of thing I have in mind from the Brown Book. If you look at this, you could imagine Turing taking a look inside the Brown Book. It's obvious. There's a table of commands. You string it together into a string of letters, and then you get a result in terms of human action. And Wittgenstein, even in the Brown Book, raises what he later calls a problem. Namely, he's been dealing with language games like this, and he says, okay, I'm just going to call this training. And now I'm going to use a notion of general training. Let's suppose we can make sense of any rule taught to any person. Later, Wittgenstein comes back and starts calling that a problem. And my guess is that Turing saw what he had to do by reading the Brown Book. Okay, that's... What Turing offered was a remarkable analysis of the very idea of taking a step in a formal system, precisely by embedding the idea of calculation and a logic in a shared human world. So the entire paper turns on an analogy. This analysis does not turn on a theory of mental states, mathematics, or logic. That's very important. There's no particular philosophical theory here. Instead, Turing takes the everyday ideas of a command, which he says is always shareable. It has to be important that the routine, you can leave off for someone else, go to your lunch break, and someone else can come. This is this Hilbertian idea of reproducibility. And he works out that comparison between the activities of a human and that of a machine. Like Wittgenstein, then Turing takes the human notion of calculation as basic or simple And he builds his analogy with machines from there. So the human is priority in that analysis. There were other analyses on the market of effective steps or formal systems. None of them had the immediate persuasiveness of Turing's. And that's because, in my view, he wrote Wittgenstein. It's because it's anthropological. Turing's machines, Wittgenstein puts it in quotes, these machines are humans who calculate. So it's a comparison between the activity of someone reckoning unthinkingly according to a rule and a machine. We know since Aristotle, slaves are living tools, machines, think Spengler, Marx, all this stuff is sort of philosophically in the background. Of course, there's no reference to Marx explicitly in philosophical investigations. You would never do that. But you can sort of, if you know what to look for, you can sort of see. So Turing solves Hilbert's decision problem, which could be phrased this way. Is there a definite method or general algorithm for deciding yes or no whether or not a sentence of a theory couched in a formal system of logic follows from the axioms? And the way Hardy put it in his lectures at Cambridge was, do mathematicians make discoveries by turning the handles of a miraculous formal machine? The answer to Hilbert is no. There exists no general algorithm, no super mechanism, to quote Wittgenstein in his variety of writings, to decide whether or not one sentence follows from another in a logic. Thinking is not in general reducible to algorithms. More generally, there is no general algorithm to determine in advance, and this gets us back to Renouvier and Ernesto's complexity argument for freedom, right? It's the same. This is what you were saying, which is fascinating to me. The important point about why Turing is so important for the history of science is we used to think if you had a bunch of simple equations that you could, like Laplace, you could sort of plug in some values and then you could predict how things are going to go. And guess what? Due to Turing, you realize, no, you can have really simple equations and you have no idea what they're going to do. You have no idea until you actually run the thing, which is why Silicon Valley is destroying so many things. Okay, so this is what Stephen Wolfram calls computational irreducibility. And it's not maybe a metaphysical argument like Renouvier, but it's kind of an inheritance of that. Now, Turing says in many of his writings, this shows there'll always be a need for humans to use common sense, something that you can't really formalize. And Wittgenstein argues with him about this idea of common sense in the lectures, but in any case, I think you see the point. There's always a residue outside of the algorithmic perspective, and it's a human perspective. So this is a basic point about what he does. To obtain a positive result that there is a machine or algorithm that could accomplish that task, all you have to do is write down the method or algorithm. So if there had been one algorithm, then that's all he had to do. But of course, to show that there is no such algorithm to have an impossibility result is much more difficult because you actually have to give an account of what in general it would be for anyone to have solved that problem. So it requires an analysis of the notion of a definite method. That's what he has to do. And here is the point. To see what a formal system of logic is, we can't just write down another formal system. So this was the problem with Gödel and Rosser and Kleene. They were mathematicians. They kept writing down the lambda calculus, the equation systems. It doesn't help. What you have to do is think. So you have to clarify what is a formal system of logic. And this was done by looking at what it's used for. The answer is logic is used by human beings who speak, act, calculate, and converse in an embodied social world. Words are constantly embedded in forms of life. And it's a different lecture that I actually sort of talked about this last time I was on the screen here in Sao Paulo. And this is clear in Turing's writings on AI later on. He says the most important search of the future will be the cultural search. So I just put that in there to make sure culture is part of Turing too. Okay, how did I get to this reading? Well, I looked at some remarks in Wittgenstein, and then I went back and I was astonished to read the 1936 paper again. No one had noticed this. The diagonal argument, and it is a diagonal argument, importantly, that Turing gives, it's a careful argument. He doesn't give the argument most people think he gave, which is called the halting argument, which is where you build negation into the machine that goes down the diagonal. He doesn't do that because he wants even an intuitionistic logician to accept his analysis. So briefly put, it's not part of our notion of following a rule step by step or computing that we do or do not obey the law of the excluded node. That's not part of the notion. Turing's analysis of a step in a formal system is altogether independent, actually, of which formal system we're speaking of or which states of mind are actually used. This is the advantage of the language game approach. Now, you read the Blue Book and you think, what is this guy doing? I mean, I can't imagine what his students were thinking. But actually, that's what you have to do. You have to get rid of any particular formal system. So there's a contrast, for example, with Carnap's principle of tolerance. Turing is not taking up a metamathematical strategy. So unlike Carnap, the choice of logic is not at issue. Which particular laws doesn't matter. The choice of linguistic framework is not at issue. I mean, if there's one alphabet, you can use another one. I mean, you have to use some alphabet, and that's really important. You have to write something down, but the consistency of the command structure, not at issue. The internal coherence or strength of a metastance is not at issue. So the point is that formalization doesn't settle the importance of what Turing did. Philosophy does. So I like to tell the computer scientists, people wouldn't have a department, okay, without philosophy. And here's Gödel, who understood very well. He says the precise and unquestionably adequate definition, I'm not sure there are any unquestionably adequate definitions, but never mind, of the general concept of formal system made possible by Turing's work allows the incompleteness theorems to be proved rigorously for every consistent formal system containing a certain amount of finitary number theory. So this is very important. For Gödel proved the incompleteness of arithmetic, but somebody could have said to him in 1930, okay, you proved that this system is incomplete. I mean, how do we know there isn't another one? So it's a fundamental problem about the scope of his theorem. And he sees that Turing fixed it up. Then he says, well, Turing's analysis of computability, one has for the first time succeeded in giving an absolute notion of an interesting epistemological notion. That is one not depending on the formalism chosen. So Gödel is enchanted with this idea of what he calls absoluteness. You see, which functions are computable stays the same no matter what formal system or how strong the axioms are. It never changes. You can transport it everywhere. So it's absolute. It's like absolute music that you can play on different instruments. Gödel sees this is just absolutely amazing. And what is the reason? Well, here's the diagonal sort of, it's a picture. I don't know if it helps. What Turing shows is that the notion of nonsense is fundamental to logic. A partial function is the most general notion, a function that's only defined on certain inputs. And so you see these little down arrows for me represent the places where the machine doesn't do anything. Okay, and so you can't diagonalize out of this class of functions because it's like Swiss cheese. You have holes there, so you can't go down the diagonal and change it because you have no idea what that thing is going to do. Okay. Most of all, Turing's diagonal argument is Wittgensteinian. This was what amazed me when I went back and looked. What he does is he gives a positive diagonal argument. So you define the diagonal as, row 1, column 1, row 2, column 2. You go down, okay? Now, in Cantor's diagonal argument, you change 0 to 1 and 1 to 0 or whatever it is. But in Turing's, you don't. You just define the machine, and then you show that the machine doesn't know what to do when it gets to itself. Okay, so there's a circle. There's not a contradiction. It's not a proof by reductio. It's a proof by emptiness. So the problem metaphorically is that it's like drawing a card in a game that says, do what you do, or I do what I do. That's really what it is. So the problem is not a contradiction. The problem is a rule that can't be followed. So that's a purely philosophical point. I'm sure Turing knew what he was doing, and I'm sure Wittgenstein saw, right? The point is you reduce it to a tautology of sorts that you can't actually do anything with. And what this shows is that the human interface, the context of actually a shareable command that you actually can do something with. I mean, of course, do what you do could find a meaning. If I'm teaching you to ride a bicycle and I tell you to keep doing what you do, okay, that's fine. But in the context of Hilbert theory, there's no such context, in which case it just makes no sense. But not because it's a contradiction or a paradox or anything like that. It's pragmatic. So this, from Wittgenstein's point of view, demonstrates that the notion of following a rule is basic to our notion of logic. So it is very rigorous. And I did find, thank goodness, one little page from my shreds of evidence include this. And now this is a picture of the diagonal argument. In my fantasies or my thoughts, Watson and Wittgenstein and Turing were sitting down discussing this. Now this, you could see in the picture, he's changing 0 to 1. So this is more like the contour argument. But it would be very easy to begin to think, wait a second, you don't need to change 0 to 1. You just define the diagonal number and then you get a circle. Okay, now I'm going to get briefly 3 more slides, I think. I'm going to say something about necessities because I've tried to give you a sort of technical argument that there's no super machine and that Wittgenstein's anthropological turn is necessary. I do not believe that the logical laws must be valid everywhere. There may very well be a case in which the law of the excluded middle doesn't hold, as if this were an empirical proposition and one had to warn against blindly assuming that he agrees. But I do say, and this is said to himself, to me it's very moving, get used to seeing a variety of techniques of science. He's telling himself, get used to it. I do not want to eliminate a prejudice of opinion, but of technique. For example, don't be dismayed in principle by a contradiction. So he and Turing discussed this at length in the 39 lectures. So here's the anthropological point. The logical must is a component part of the propositions of logic, and these are not propositions of human natural history. If what a proposition of logic said was, human beings agree with one another in such and such ways, and that would be the form of the natural historical proposition, then its contradictory would say that there is here a lack of agreement, not that there is agreement of another kind. The agreement of humans that is a presupposition of logic is not an agreement in opinions, much less in opinions on questions of logic. Okay? Now, I just want to end here. In the investigations, it's not that what I've been talking about clarifies everything by any means, because rules and calculations and logic are not part of a lot of parts of life. So this is a very important passage where Wittgenstein says the notion of technique will not help. It's in the second part of the investigations. Is there such a thing as expert judgment about the genuineness of expressions of feeling by humans? Okay. Here too, there are those with better and those with worse judgment. In general, predictions arising from judgments of those with better knowledge of people will be more correct. Can one learn this knowledge? Yes, some can learn it, not, however, by taking a course of study, but through experience. Can someone else be a man's teacher in this? Certainly. From time to time, he gives him the right tip. So we should think about the psychoanalyst and the patient here. And give him a tip. This is what learning and teaching are like here. So to become a psychoanalyst, you have to go through a psychoanalysis yourself. What one acquires here is not a technique. One learns correct judgments. There are also rules, but they do not form a system. And only experienced people can apply them rightly, unlike calculating rules. So everything I've talked about is only part of the whole panoply of things, and the subjective and the objective are going to have to be treated differently by Wittgenstein. But I think I'll end there. Now, this is a picture I found last night. This is the first hot piece of expensive art generated by a robot. Sotheby's is going to sell it. They have it on the books for £150,000. We're going to see if it sells. It is Turing's portrait as composed by Ida, who is named after Ada Lovelace, of course. Ida is the robot, and Ida produced the AI God, which is, of course, some kind of pixels of Turing. And I think this is a nice way to frame my talk because we're back to religion, which is what we're doing coming out of Silicon Valley, I'm afraid, in various forms. So I'll stop here. Thank you. Obrigado.
Thank you. Perhaps we could have a very short.
Great.
Okay, sure. So let's have 5 for a short break and coffee, but just not more than 5, right?
Yeah. Obrigado.
Thank you so very much. Awesome.
Well, you see how all the talks
That's awesome. That's awesome. That's something I was telling Mario that we didn't combine in advance, but it was awesome.
but we're all kind of chewing on the same.
Yeah, it's kind of scary.
Isn't it scary? My brother sent me that last night.
Wow.
It was in the Daily
I must found the whole story behind it.
Silicon Valley people spending all their art doing these things.
That's crazy.
Of course, she's in the
But so good in your work on
yeah, you're doing this too. Yeah, so we have to talk about
I really would like to know more about Juliet.
Well, we have to all talk with each other about this, don't you think? I mean, we have to each talk to other humanities centers, directors around the world to coordinate what we do. This is why you're reading the series so interesting as well, because I'm reading the language, these symbolic forms and keeping track of all this stuff. It is very
Just forms of life.
for me, it's forms of life, and I think Suzanne Langer, her later work, she lived a very long time. She read Wittgenstein, and she went through her symbolic forms of logic, and then she gets biology, forms of life, the aesthetics of forms of life. And she has read, I just discovered about a month ago, she has read Turing's paper on Genesis, where he does the equations for a flower, the petals of the flower, and a certain kind of thing. So she's interested in forms of life. Yeah, it's a very powerful book. I think it's just great. But,
let's be in touch because I would like to know what you're doing. So
I'd love feedback on their website. I have some students out there. I have one person. They're now getting me to Facebook, which is taking a while. I'm very lucky because like Alistair McIntyre and some of my teachers, they did it back in 1980. The National Endowment for the Humanities, which had not been cut back, gave them $1 million, and so it's been growing. So I don't have a huge budget, but I'm supposed to go raise more. So only recently I got a new president. She has the donors. So all of these questions business people have talked about, what's the use of having a child take a course, all the things Susan was talking about, which I have to talk about.
I think,
Yeah, that's huge.
It's something really challenging. That's why I was doing that great search on it, because it actually happens, and I think that's people were so awesome. Wait. Okay.
Maybe I need to go back.
Go there. Go there. This is.
No.
Okay, people, we're getting back. Now with comments by Professor Mauro Engelmann. Mauro, please. I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation. Of course, it's always a pleasure to be here and to learn about the origins of the philosophy of the 20th century. Now, I will comment actually on Floyd's paper, which is the ground for this talk. And so sometimes, if you get lost, we can make things more explicit, actually. So I will dispute some of the expressions she uses to talk about anthropological term, expressions with which I kind of disagree. And so my point is to see if we can reach agreement, and of course, agreement towards a better understanding of Wittgenstein's anthropological perspective, as I prefer to call it. So I will read something I wrote. I think it's easier. Hopefully, it doesn't get very boring. One of Floyd's major concerns has been to clear the path for a view that neither allows for variations of relativism nor for mythological solutions like Platonism or idealism, linguistic like in Malcolm or otherwise. In the case of Wittgenstein, the right path seems to guarantee that philosophy is not an activity up on the air, far away from our daily concerns. However, the right path might be a winding, long road. Floyd is in line with predecessors like the Putnam of the good times who rebelled against any threat to the fact of mutual understanding, and Stanley Cavell, who saw in culture a way to stability and not to desperation. Floyd's line is that one should not bargain objectivity when a human face is introduced in logic, particularly when we try to grasp the hardness of the logical must inside forms of life. Here, I have to change this. Here, the plural, understood historically or as a contemporaneous phenomenon, seems to already to be a trend. The new background trouble in Floyd's works, it seems to me, is that the plural is inevitable when we introduce discussions of culture. The historical threat appears, for instance, in the notion that she uses of evolving forms of life. Why is that? Well, the cultural threat appears in the statement that logical necessities turn out to be evolving activities of self-critically embedding words, as she says, analogies and trains of thought in forms of life. So my understanding of Floyd's strategy is that she wants us to see that we should not be scared. I'm scared. Don't get me wrong. Threats of various sorts are real, according to Floyd herself. But reason, understood in a sober way, not in a punch-drunk metaphysical way, is good enough for us and for any group of humans inside cultural variations in the present or in the past. Okay, now, I do think that this is a good picture of things that Wittgenstein is doing. The question is then how he's doing it, really. My major concern is Floyd's apparent equivalence between, I quote, logical necessities and evolving activities of self-critically embedding words, analogies, and trains of thought in forms of life. Here, my feeling is that we have gone too far, and it seems that a retreat is actually needed. So my comments will have like 4 parts. The first is Floyd's declining decline. A central point of Floyd's talk is that after 1937, the differentiation of praxis and technique is quite important for Wittgenstein. For the notion of technique is not used as purely technical, as he says in a Spenglerian way, but actually as a response to Spengler's statement of cultural decline into what I call Floyd, a living measure of himself and his own techniques. The suggestion is double, I think. On the one hand, she wants to make the point that, I quote, necessity of logic and mathematics, in order to retain the rigor of logic, should not be dead or cultish, but living and expressive organic. Now, this means that they should be embedded in forms of life as evolving activities. I will return to this again and again. Now, on the other hand, there is an implicit Cavelian optimistic suggestion of declining decline. This suggestion might be misleading in my view. It is quite true that, as Floyd points out, Wittgenstein resists, as she calls, Spengler's idea that the technische achievements of mathematics inevitably signal cultural decline or apotheosis. However, what Wittgenstein resists is the idea of inevitability, of the inevitable decline, and not of factual decline, before and after the wars, I think. I see Wittgenstein denying one, but not the other. This distinction, I think, opens an interesting issue to discuss, that is the background point concerning the anthropological perspective. So the difference between assumed necessity, psychological must, and ontological must, and general facts understood inside a worldview, and general facts simplicity. Now, the anthropological perspective introduces, I think, variations of general facts real, that you have to accept, that show that transcendental reasoning does not work as logical reasoning. I think one of the important points from anthropological perspective is really to move from possibilities to facts. So we have a kind of disagreement. You have to trust facts. The question is, which are the facts that you can trust and how you select them. Now, for instance, Wittgenstein says, or how am I to describe the important empirical fact here? Am I to say experience teaches that I always count the same way? Of course, this is not the important fact for him. This is the empiricist view. Or am I to say none of the numerals gets lost in copying, etc.? So he always has this concern of the important empirical fact that we have to agree on, or that we should see as the basis for agreement, etc. Okay, now I turn to the idea that necessity of logic and mathematics in order to retain the rigor of logic should not be dead or cultish, but living and expressive, organic, as Floyd says. It is in this point that we find Floyd's apparent equivalence that scares me between logical necessities and evolving activities of self-critically embedding words, analogies, and trains of thought in forms of life. My impression here is that in trying to deny cultural decline, Floyd unwittingly ends up threatening to decline the hardness of the logical necessity. Here we are in a dangerous area. So as the philosopher David Byrne would ask, how did we get here? This is the philosopher of Talking Heads, of course. Much of what I will say in what follows consists in framing questions concerning the introduction of the anthropological perspective in order to get new answers and strategies from the speaker. I'm not quite satisfied with the way I frame questions, but despite that, I hope that it might bring us a little further in the debate. So the second point down then is the long road to understanding each other, about praxis and technique before the anthropological perspective is introduced. Now, this topic shows its importance in a passage that Juliet uses frequently. I will quote Wittgenstein. One can talk about the function of the word in the sentence, in the language game, in the language, but function in each of these cases means technique, and therefore refers to a general explanation and training. Okay, as Floyd makes clear, the idea that words and sentences involve a multiplicity of techniques is clear to Wittgenstein only in 37. Now, how then could he reach this conclusion? It seems that what is close to the notions of practice and technique, but also to function and training, is the notion of method. So we have methods to operate with certain tools. Now, we go back to the Tractatus and then to the middle period and see the following.
The function of words was understood in the Tractatus to the extent that one understood the sentence in which words appear. Words have meaning and a function in the context of sentences. So some people call this the context principle. I don't think this principle is derived from Frege exactly, but it's in part very Husserlian too, but this doesn't matter. Okay, so understanding the function of words was understanding truth conditions of sentences where words occur. This was the Tractatus. However, after 1929, when Wittgenstein returns to Cambridge, he thought that this was not enough for the understanding of words. More restricted conditions for understanding were needed, so that besides knowing truth conditions, one needed to know how truth is determined. This then implied an extension of the notion of context dependency, for in order to know how to determine the truth of a simple sentence like Peter will arrive at 4 p.m., one needs to understand the workings of a tool, namely a watch. Similarly, one understands how to tell the truth and falsehood of Peter is 2 meters tall by knowing how to operate a measuring tool, measuring rod, if you wish. So, method is fundamental. And this is why when people talk about verificationism in Wittgenstein, they should remember the relevance of methods. And the thing is, Wittgenstein's way of verification is certainly not the one that the logical positivists defend. Why is that? Because in essence, these tools express rules of language, presumed fixed inside a system of rules, implicit in the way that we understand each other. So one thing about verificationism in Wittgenstein is to make explicit the rules assumed in the understanding of sentences. So this is why I call this explicitation verificationism, although explicitation is not a nice word, I've heard. A result of the extension of the context was to count as part of language then tools, physical objects like rulers, watches, samples, etc. This is interesting that appears back in Philosophical Investigations, paragraph 14, and Wittgenstein says we can go both ways. Either we count this as language or not. But his first movement was to say that this must be part of language because they are conditions for the understanding of certain sentences. Now, what I want to suggest here then is that instead of focusing on the distinction between praxis and technique, we should perhaps focus on the distinction between method and technique. You see, if you look at the passages, I've checked at least 10 in the Remarks on the Foundations of Mathematics, you could basically replace one for the other. But then you say you may lose something. Exactly, that's the point. Now, I would suggest then that technique comes from method. I will see if we can agree on that. But there are some things in the word technique that don't come manifest. They don't appear manifest if you use the word method. Okay? So perhaps technique brings an important addition. One interesting addition it brings is that we don't talk about method, and so we don't talk about method of verification immediately. Why is this interesting? Because if you see, the meetings of the Moral Science Club in Cambridge in 37-8, Wittgenstein complains about the way people talked about the supposed method of verification. So if you don't talk about method of verification, you don't talk about method, and maybe better to use the word technique. But there might be other reasons to use the word technique as well. Okay. Now, one interesting question behind all this is how the rules are fixed inside language, the rules of understanding, the rules that we supposedly make explicit. One could ask if they are really fixed or if they are essentially different from rules of logic and mathematics when we talk about rules concerning phenomenology or measuring, etc. So now we have the problem of the status of different kinds of rules that we did not have at the time of the Tractatus. And perhaps the anthropological perspective relates to that too. Now, what is interesting is that if talking about understanding a sentence and talking about truth conditions was not sufficient in the Tractatus, was not enough, so we had to extend the notion of context. Well, you could think that something similar happens with anthropological perspective, right? Now, it looks like the notion of the anthropological notions, they extend the context. In which ways? Well, you seem to go to a place where you cannot go to a different extension anymore, because once you reach forms of life, so you reach the maximal level of, say, generalization, if you want, of context, right? Now, an interesting thing then is, it doesn't matter form of life, I understood culturally or biologically, if you understand that biologically actually is redundant, because if you don't have any cultural, you can also talk about a broad notion of culture, so that any biological restriction is also possible. Now, in a broad sense, we can always imagine animals similar to human beings, and this gives us the irrelevance or the redundancy of the biological. Okay, now I go to the third point, which is mathematics as part of culture. So one intriguing sentence by Floyd is the following, I quote, "Wittgenstein's anthropological turn involves confronting the work of Hilbert, Brouwer, Ramsey, and Turing as expressions of culture." Now, I think this view is partially justified by Wittgenstein writing that proofs of consistency will appear in the right light as obsolete or to have to be completely reinterpreted. Okay, Juliet quoted this passage actually. However, this reinterpretation mentioned by Wittgenstein does not look anthropological, for this remark is from 1930, so several years before anthropological perspective is adopted actually. So it's not clear to me in which way the anthropological turn implies confronting, say, Brouwer as an expression of culture at this point. Now, despite this fact, one might think that in one way or another, all humans' enterprises are expressions of culture, right? So there is no invention, discovery, or human activity that lies outside culture. The threat here is that we might trivialize the notion of culture. Well, in a Freudian mood, I would say this is perhaps not totally undesirable, right? If you think about mathematics, that it really looks indeed completely independent of culture, of facts. So now we have to see then, I think, what is internal or external to Wittgenstein's view and how far his general views of culture imply a reinterpretation, to what extent does the anthropological perspective implies that. Now, I'll go to the fourth point, learning and mastering the technique of numerals, counting and being trained. Now, Wittgenstein's first language game in the philosophical investigation is one about sending someone to buy 5 red apples. So the shopkeeper, we are told, knows the elementary series of numbers, and he is able to say the series so that, I quote Wittgenstein, for each number word, he takes an apple of the same color as the sample of the drawer. He masters the technique of saying the sequence of numbers and the technique of counting one by one at least. However, he does not master the technique of hearing the name of a color and grasping an object of that color. So he needs a chart for that. Instead, he masters the technique of hearing the name of the color and looking for the right color in a chart. Thus, one sees that techniques are replaceable, and more than one technique can achieve the same. Moreover, the shopkeeper could be a different person using one or the other technique. So technicians are replaceable. This seems to be an important point for the way Floyd approximates Wittgenstein and Turing. Now, replaceability then is characteristic of technique, and therefore it gives a minimal notion of objectivity, at least in the sense of changing the subject. One might have his own technique, a technique that nobody else in fact uses, but it is important that other people might use it after learning it. Now, is this something that distinguishes praxis and technique? What other characteristics point to objectivity in the notion of technique? Now, we do not know how the shopkeeper learned the technique. The examples of learning in PI show that learning is a first kind of training, however. So we should imagine that if we have a description of his learning, it will be a training. Now, why is this relevant? Because it seems now that training, learning technique but being trained, like the dogs are trained, right? This is quite relevant. Other animals are trained. This is the basic for agreement. So you could think that technique is the basis for agreement. Now, concerning now this view now, we should remember, I think, that if it is true that what I said about method and technique, that training is a notion not connected to the old notion of method, but it is obviously connected with the notion of technique. So this could be a new reason for Wittgenstein to prefer technique instead of method, actually, if it is true that he changes one for them, of course. Thus, it seems that it seems that learning a technique is a more fruitful notion than learning a method for the later Wittgenstein. Okay, finally, my last point is Frege. So Frege's introduction to Grundgesetze is a quite important piece of philosophical work, it seems to me, and to a lot of people, right? Despite being the object of study very often, I think that there is an interesting line of thought that has not been explored. He might have presented the first argument for the unjustifiability of grammar, that is, logic and mathematics in this case. So, laws of logic, according to Frege, either they are derived from other laws of logic, or there is no justification for them. The reasoning assumes that there are fundamental laws of logic, those that cannot be derived from other ones. That is, we have necessarily a set of primitive laws. Now, the reasoning seems to imply that nothing can be more fundamental than logic, neither metaphysics nor psychology. So you can derive a lot of these views from the argument for the unjustifiability of logic. In fact, Frege explicitly says so. But it's his intention, I think, with other things that he says about the truths of mathematics being there independently of any person and so on. Okay. One might think, however, that we can find a sort of transcendental justification for logic by pointing out that without fundamental laws of logic, human life does not work. A reasoning apparently similar to Aristotle in Metaphysics Gamma could go on in the following way. If we do not accept the laws of logic, then we jeopardize all reasoning, all dialogue, and we cannot even communicate. This kind of reasoning, Frege claims, is no justification of the truth of basic laws, for the truth it simply does not follow from this argument. It's a quite interesting argument against transcendental argument. At best, the only thing that follows is that we should take the laws as true, which is something quite different. So if you use an argument, I would say, of the kind of, if you don't accept logic, you get chaos, this pragmatic argument saying, what you get is we should take laws of logic as true, which is completely different from laws of logic being true. So the trouble with Frege's conception of fundamental laws is that it seems to imply an element of contingency. I think this is the view of the Wittgenstein Tractatus. Why is that? Basic laws are true about everything, being truths of maximal generality for Frege. But if the laws are as contentful as natural laws, but only more general, it seems that they can be denied with sense, particularly because Frege's notion of necessity coincides itself with maximal generality. thus it seems that his own conception allows for the existence of logical aliens. Thus, this is not just a feature of logical psychology. Frege's own conception seems to imply that. The advantage of his conception, according to himself, in relation to the psychologists, is that he can say that he is right, and that the one who denies a logical law is wrong, false, which is something that the psychologists cannot do, supposedly. So the psychologists, according to Frege, must accept that nobody is wrong, given that he defends that logical laws describe how people actually think. Okay, the strategy of the Tractatus is quite different from Frege's, but Wittgenstein is aiming at the same, namely the unjustifiability of logic. The notion of tautology itself shows that. Why is that? First, there is no possible justification for logic, for nothing makes logic true. Second, there is no need of psychology or metaphysics, for tautological logic does not depend on these matters. Third, there is no threat of logical aliens either, for there is nothing that can be significantly denied in the laws of logic, for they're empty of content. Okay, now what happens with Wittgenstein later? So later Wittgenstein says grammar is unjustifiable. And now you see again Frege on the background. Why is grammar unjustifiable? He says, suppose you have a rule of grammar and you want to derive it from an empirical proposition. Now the question is this empirical proposition a proposition with sense or not? The answer, of course, must be it makes sense. So if it makes sense, right, it makes sense because the rule of grammar already apply. So if you want to justify the rule of grammar, you get into a circle. So you cannot go this way. The second possibility would be to say that this empirical sentence is not in accordance with the rule of grammar. But if it's not, then it is nonsense. Well, nonsense cannot justify anything. Conclusion, rules of grammar cannot be justified. Okay, well, the problem is, it seems to me that what happens after this phase in which Wittgenstein has his arguments for the unjustifiability of grammar is that he introduces anthropological perspective. And this argument, the question is it useful? Can we actually use it? Does it make sense? Okay. Now, I will read a passage of Zettel to finish my intervention here. And then I'll make the final question related to Frege and Wittgenstein. The passage I want to quote is paragraph 299. He says that, we say, he's quoted now, if you really follow the rule of multiplying, it must come out the same. It must. Now, when this is merely the slightly hysterical style of university talk, we have no need to be particularly interested. It is, however, the expression of an attitude towards the technique of multiplying, which comes out everywhere in our lives. The emphasis of the must corresponds only to the inexorability of this attitude, not merely towards the technique of calculating, but also towards innumerable related practices. Now, what is the problem here? And this is a problem I find in the way Juliet expresses herself sometimes. So is Wittgenstein simply saying that necessity applies to attitudes, right? If so, taking as true and not truth itself is the source of necessity. Okay. So I think this is the biggest danger of talking about the anthropological perspective in the sense of evolving and embedding forms of life. So my question then is how Wittgenstein respond to Frege here, I think.
Thank you so much, Mauro. It's characteristically smart and informed and challenging. He's very good at challenging. So, I don't know how well I'm going to do. Maybe I can have some help from the audience in reply to this. Okay, there certainly is a danger of the anthropological method. And at the end, I was going to start and go in order, but the end rephrases the danger very well. In terms of Frege, who imagines confronting the psychological logicians who reason rather differently and contradict things seemingly without worry. And Frege comes to the point in confronting them where he says, I cannot accept what they say as correct. At least this is true for me. Now, it's characteristic of Frege to understand the logical point wonderfully. So what he's saying is that I could be wrong. What I have is taking it that their modes of reasoning do not track truth. They are not laws of truth. But in the end, you get down to, so I hold. And for Frege, the distinction between holding for true and being true is very fundamental. Now, one thing Wittgenstein did very early was to deny that the laws of logic are true. So I think this is, I'm very much in agreement with the idea. Maybe Frege's argument is showing us that we're wrong to think of truth in connection with the generality of logical laws. So that would be, I now see a transition toward the anthropological point of view. Let's say we adopt an anthropological view on how people take things to be true or how people take things to follow with necessity. And then we could investigate, for example, how Brouwer operates without the law of the excluded middle. And we could anthropologically investigate how Cantor operates with the excluded middle. And we could be sober, and that could be what we do. And notice that what falls out of that is indeed a Tractarian idea, that logic is not composed of truths itself. It's composed of forms. Another thing that I thought of as you were talking is the whole issue of rule following, which is not so clear in Frege, but which is very clear even in the Tractatus. You know, Wittgenstein read this Lewis Carroll, Achilles and the Tortoise, where Lewis Carroll imagines writing down modus ponens as a rule. So you have if P then Q, therefore you can conclude Q. However, there's a problem, because you're only justified in concluding Q and cutting from P to Q if there's another rule that you could write down. If P and P, if P then Q, then Q. So you have to write down another line. And now you see the game is up, because now you need yet another rule, which is if P and Q, then Q, and if P, then Q. So it goes. Now, what Wittgenstein, when he talks about showing in the Tractatus, is doing, I think, is already suggesting that there are two ways to respond to this. One is to say that logic is not formal, that you have to do something practical, right? That it's not just by writing down symbols, you have to act. So that's kind of one way of thinking about it. And therefore, he's already saying that following a rule has to be taken as a basic notion in logic. Now, Russell quotes the Lewis Carroll in Principia and in Principles of Math. And what Russell says is this shows that logic is not completely formalizable. Wittgenstein is rejecting that. He's saying, oh no, it's completely formalizable, but you just have to take as basic the notion of following a rule. And so we see in Turing how far that goes. I mean, it's really internal to the notion of logic. So I love this idea of reading Frege as sort of bordering on the emptiness of logic. But it is a problem. You can only work from within logic. You can't just jump in there. So we start with what I take to be true, what I take to be false. That's an anthropological kind of point, even for Frege. So I appreciate your connecting those passages. Now, you brought this home to me, however, with the beginning, with your first question about declining decline. So I'm an American, and often I say to Enkelman, I have a kind of somewhat, I don't know if optimistic is the right word. I'm rather pragmatic. I think this came out in our discussion yesterday. So I think Wittgenstein wrote the investigations, indeed believing that the actual fact was culture is dead. Okay, I do not say that he wrote the investigations in a happy, pragmatic spirit of thinking that, everything is going to get better. On the other hand, I see him as a kind of sober realist. It looks bad, and as a matter of fact, it is bad. And if we look at our time, it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad. But still, he wrote the investigations, and I think he wrote it for us to sit and discuss and think about these issues. He wrote it to defend philosophy in spite of what he says about philosophy. His, of course, is not the hysterical comments of people talking about logic or verificationism. It's supposed to not be hysterical. But this is why the notion of possibility, to go to your second, the notion of the possibility of sense is very important to me. Because he's not saying that it does make sense. He's not saying that we do make sense or that we have reason to believe rationality in Habermas style will make itself felt. He's not giving us reasons for that, and he's not tipping his hand either way. But philosophy for Wittgenstein always deals in spaces of possibility in light of what is the case. And I would say this begins in the Tractatus and goes onward. And one big difference from Frege, and I owe the articulation of this point to Sanford Che, whose marvelous book on Frege makes the point. Frege extrudes modality absolutely from logic. He says this notion of possibility makes no sense for us. Now, partly he's trying to extrude transcendental arguments, which is what Mauro has said. But Wittgenstein is bringing the notions of possibility and necessity back into philosophy, and then attempting to master them, not by postulating possible worlds or something like that. I'm not fond of those readings of the Tractatus. But what's basic for Wittgenstein always, even in the Tractatus, is I make a statement, and then what I need to do is to see through my making of the statement, to see myself realizing one possibility among many. I take it that's in the Tractatus, and I consider that to be part and parcel of what I understand the anthropological view to be. So maybe we have a disagreement about this. I do not deny that Wittgenstein thought we were in an era of actual decline. I mean, I certainly would agree with that. So I don't think it's a matter of getting back to the facts. I think it's a matter of putting the facts in the right light and seeing contingencies where they are. And part of the whole point is to see that necessity rides on the back of a variety of contingencies, which is, of course, what you're afraid of. But the deep point is, no, you don't have any notion of necessity without dealing with those contingencies. There's a very funny moment in the 1939 lectures with Turing in the first lecture. And people don't notice it. Wittgenstein says, well, suppose that I write a sigma, the Greek letter sigma, on the board. And I say to Turing, that's a sigma. I'm teaching him. In other words, I'm training him what a sigma is. And then suppose I say to Turing, write me down here a sigma. And Turing goes up to the blackboard and tries to cut that piece of the blackboard off and bring me the piece of the blackboard. Okay. Now that's a joke between the two of them about the matters I was discussing in the lecture. It happens very early. And what Wittgenstein is saying is, no, that doesn't happen. Turing is able to be trained into something like a technique that's more general. I think this idea that technique has an origin in Wittgenstein's notions of method is very deep, actually. I never would have thought of that connection, so thank you for that. But I also think that what you said about why technique is maybe better than method, it makes manifest how the rules of understanding are fixed. And I don't know if it makes manifest that they're different from rules of math, because I guess having lived the life I have lived, I see mathematical culture as part of culture. And I think mathematics is absolutely ridden through with culture. So for me, given the way I lived in the United States in my generation, there are different cultures within mathematics. That's very, very important. So maybe that's just a verbal thing about what we mean by culture. I don't know. Okay. There are many other things. Let's see. If I like this idea, if all human enterprises are culture, then we trivialize the notion. So I think that's the right way to read what I'm saying about Wittgenstein. You can't anymore. We don't live in a world anymore in which you can appeal to culture from on high. So I think that's a very deep point. I think that's actually true of our world. So that's okay, because that means we have to start dealing in philosophy with modes of popular culture, things we may not even think are culture, various things about technology. Your remark about the middle Wittgenstein making watches and rulers part of the language is really very interesting too. If you think about contemporary life, because the mobile phone is really part of the reality of words flying around all around us. So that's a very Wittgensteinian thing. And those are methods. But I don't see that much of a difference with the mathematics. So you're the expert on the middle Wittgenstein, I'm not, but let's take an example. Okay, so suppose we have a light bulb that's blinking darker blue and lighter blue. And let's say that there are only two states of the bulb, darker blue and lighter blue. Or no, do I want it to be continuous? I'm not sure. But anyway, think of it as discrete. Then I take it that the middle Wittgenstein is saying against the Tractatus. If I ask, is the light blue contained in the dark blue when I see the dark of the bulb? Okay, I think he asked this kind of question. I don't know if he asked this particular one. You'll know. If I ask in ordinary language, is the light blue contained of, is it part of the darker blue? Ordinary language doesn't determine an answer to that question. All right, so you could have it one way or you could have it another way, and these would be different systems. But the point is that there would be a choice about how you apply number and how you apply containment. So I forget where I was going with this, but anyway, I guess I'm thinking that the mathematics and logic are not so separate from that issue of methods. And I'm not sure you were denying that. I'm pretty sure you were. I don't know about the biological being redundant in forms of life and animals being similar to human beings and so on and so forth. I don't really know. I know that when Wittgenstein alludes to Hilbert, Hilbert at one point has this stroke notation, and he points out that that's a very bad notation because, for certain purposes, because the difference between 27 strokes and 28 strokes is not something that we can actually take in at a glance. We actually have to count. We actually need to develop mathematics so that we can differentiate the 27 from the 28 and so on and so forth. So Wittgenstein's very interested in that. And that involves certain biological features of us. Now, they're shared with animals. So, psychologists study the number sense. Spiders, we hear these things. This is, again, about cultural hyping, sexing of the dossier. We hear that spiders have arithmetic. Okay, that is not what the experiments are showing. What they're showing is there's probably some biologically or evolutionary common capacity to discriminate between 1 and 3 dots, or 2 and 3. And then in most biological creatures, you get to 4, and then after that, they can't differentiate. Okay, so that's an interesting thing. It's called subitizing. So what's the limits of subitizing? And the important point biologically would be there must be some capacity to subitize. And then whether it's 3 or 4 or whether spiders have it or not is kind of not. But then the important point is that that capacity gives out. And what I think Hilbert is saying is not that the stroke notation is somehow the formalistic signs are the ultimate foundations of mathematics. Very often he's read that way as some kind of metaphysical formalist. That's not what Hilbert is saying. What he's saying is we need to develop mathematics to discriminate bigger situations from one another. So there is a psychological and there is a biological set of realities there. We're not going to reduce arithmetic truth to that. But I think that those are important. So I'm a little bit confused about the biological being redundant in the forms of life. How we teach children those techniques has to do with where they are developed to at the particular point they are. It's very important with newborns, colors. It takes a while for the kids to learn. You have to sit in the bath with the bath books and teach them that. There are certain points at which music and singing and rhythm are very important for giving people a sense of number. So I think all of these things are somehow important not to wipe away. And they're also important for the anthropological perspective of Wittgenstein, because we don't want to lob on to one of them and make it sound like that's the whole ballpark. So another kind of experiment I have in mind are these cognitive studies of newborns. So you put one stuffed animal in front of the newborn, and then you put down the screen, and then you put two, and you lift up the screen, and the baby looks. So, okay, that's fine. That measures something about the number sense. But to go back to Frege, that's not our concept of number in some further articulated way. And so the fact that there are gradations in our notion of number along these paths is very important for understanding the psychological experiments. The front page of the New York Times, I'll never forget, it said, newborns have arithmetic. I mean, I just was, no, they don't. That's sexing up the dossier. So I think that's important about the biology, but I'm not quite sure what point you were going to make. Okay, I welcome the idea that the training and the Abrichtung add a little bit in connection with technique. I had not thought of that. But your real worry is, what if these necessities really come down to attitude? I don't know what the German is. Einstellung. Okay, so I don't have the German to resonate enough with Einstellung. I think we don't want to be non-cognitivists about our notion of attitude. That's my first response to this. Einstellung should not be understood in the way Bertrand Russell understood ethics, where, I have my emotions about war being wrong, but I don't pretend to tell anybody else about that. So I think we'd have to talk about that. Maybe the last quotation from my talk about the tips and understanding the genuineness of human expression, and there's no rules for that. Maybe that gets us into some kind of arena. But of course, it's the real mistake is to try to locate necessity in one place or in one kind of thing. Wittgenstein is telling us not to do that. That's why transcendental arguments are not going to have conclusions that are persuasive, because the necessity is far more organic and far more distributed across a very wide range of contingencies that we tend not to think about. So I guess for me, the great thing about the Turing is, he takes something that looks like a nothing, and now he's going to go to the heart of what the technical program is doing and show that that's there. But anyway, necessity is not in one place. That's a very Quinian conclusion as well, in a different vein. But I'll stop there. Maybe other people can help me. But thank you very much, Mauro. I have many ways to improve at this point.
Thank you. Thank you. So we are open now for questions from the audience. We even have Professor Gottfried Gabriel here. So if you like to make a question or a comment, Professor Gabriel, please be our guest. Okay. First, and then Professor Leclerc. Professor Susan.
So can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
I have a couple questions. It might be a digression here, but there were a couple of things you said. They may not be connected to each other, but that I would like to know more about. The first one is nonsense is a very important area of research.
Yeah.
The second one is we got religion coming out of Silicon Valley. That was right. That was, you tossed off at the very end. Each of those I would like to know more, within a reasonable boundary of time.
Thank you. Well, I guess we started talking about it after your talk yesterday. So it's a very Kraussian idea that the modern press manufactures all kinds of nonsense. I mean, fake news is not new. This is something that comes with the distributing of pamphlets and the industrialization of the circulation of information. But I take it that now disinformation and misinformation, I mean, I think there were 4 young professors hired at Boston University last year, all of whom work on various aspects of misinformation and disinformation. So Mark Zuckerberg had this idea that Facebook is great because anyone in the world will be able to say anything they want to anyone else at any time, which if you think about that for about 2 minutes or less, if you're a philosophy teacher, you realize it's a nightmare. So it's a nightmare. And the pragmatics of language are extremely important. We don't have any idea what it means for 1 billion people to read a tweet. I would say we just don't even quite understand that. And so in a lot of the research on this, I think philosophical issues about nonsense are actually incredibly important. In Wittgenstein's of nonsense. Now, Wittgenstein never applies the term Unsinn to anything that doesn't obey the ordinary grammatical rules of English or German. So he's not particularly interested in Lewis Carroll's nonsense poetry. But nonsense, parading a sense unwittingly, that's really a very central feature of what he's doing, for which he's been very criticized in academic philosophy for understandable reasons. You know, he's trivializing philosophy. Russell thought, others have thought, you know, what's this obsession with nonsense? To me, it's vividly displayed before us. The Silicon Valley comes because when I think of Turing and all of this talk about AI now, which of course is made by software developers who are desperate to have another $1 billion invested in LLMs, let's not forget. But I think there is a kind of public philosophy emerging from this tech world. And I think we need to think about addressing some of that. So, for example, in courses, you get a textbook and you're going to teach something on philosophy and AI. One of the sections has to do with, could you be immortal? Okay, so David Chalmers writes about this. So let's suppose, which makes no sense, frankly, that I could upload all of my mental states to a machine. Of course, Gödel and Turing show us that that can't possibly be done. But anyway, we start from that, and then the question is, would I be immortal? Or another kind of thing, could we have rules of ethics, okay, in our platforms that will give us the checklist that will prevent various bad decisions being made on the basis of these mechanical devices? You were alluding to that yesterday. So I think there's a lot of nonsense in Silicon Valley, a lot of philosophy, long-termism. Well, we do have to think about long-term consequences, but as a matter of fact, to me, if you remove the fact that I only have one shot at life, we're not talking about ethics. To me, that's just not a question. I mean, you could discuss immortality and it could be an interesting thing, but then it becomes more religion than philosophy. So I'm rather against this uploading literature. I think it's a bad way to talk about ethics. What we really need to talk about is ethics by design, ethics at each step of the process permeating the culture of people who are discussing these things. So I don't know whether that helps, but that's what comes to mind about religion in Silicon Valley.
So there is a bit of a connection between nonsense and Silicon Valley religion, perhaps.
Perhaps, yes. When I hear, the trolley problem,
Yes.
MIT can put that up on the site and it's all very nice and we do these things. That's sort of anthropological. I think it turns out there have to be 10 people before you throw the fat person. Anyway, whatever it is. So that encourages the idea that ethics consists of checklists. And the long philosophical tradition, there are many philosophers from Aristotle through Bishop Berkeley who write about the attempt to mathematize morality. That's not how it is. And that's a really important thing to bear in mind because the rhetoric being used by the software engineers who are developing this stuff, that presupposes a lot of these things. So I'm hoping that some of our philosophy graduates can go work at high-tech companies and bring serious understanding of humanistic aspects of narrative, of life, of what it is to talk about forms of life, I would like it very much if somehow they could work their way into the sensibility of these companies. But I don't know how long they would last in companies. But there's a lot of philosophy chic of a certain kind out in Silicon Valley.
What if somebody said you can solve the problem of disinformation and misinformation by reassessing freedom of speech? In other words, go back to the Bill of Rights or something and say freedom of speech needs a new definition in the culture that we have today.
So in the United States, I don't know in Brazil, but somehow the First Amendment, we're back to the Constitution. Sorry, Gabriel. Freedom of speech is so axiomatic, and the very first thing people will go to, I think there's been very interesting work, I'm forgetting names, on the First Amendment and how we understand it. I've been thinking a little bit about revenge porn. Okay, so revenge porn is very interesting because there you have sort of blackmailing people with, the couple explores and has nude photos. And then, so there's actually a problem. Danielle Citron has been working on this. I'm not sure that the First Amendment is the right way, because you could say, well, I have the freedom. If you give me a picture of yourself nude, I've got, freedom of speech. I can send it on. But there's something wrong there. But the question is, how do you fix the law properly to deal with that? So you have to explore the idea of a right to sexual privacy, for example. So that's something on the analogy of privacy in the authors of the Constitution. The original idea of privacy was a gentleman has his papers, and a gentleman can do drafts of things, and you can't come in and convict the gentleman for exploring ideas. So maybe something like that, sexual privacy could be a little bit like that. But it's an enormous amount of work to change law, both federally and state, in light of that. However, I will say that the law is changing. So, it can be done. It's just that I don't think the First Amendment is going to be too blunt an instrument to deal with a lot of these things. Revenge porn, maybe it's the law of torts, maybe it's some kind of contract. There are many contexts in which freedom of speech per se, for example, a classroom or a conference like this, not everybody gets to speak in line, and that's not violating anyone's freedom of expression. So I think the First Amendment's very important. We don't want to have to tamp down, and I don't want to leave to Mark Zuckerberg to decide or Elon Musk, for goodness sake, to decide who gets to speak. But I think the First Amendment is overused or misused or thrown at problems that people need to work harder at solving in different ways.
There is a connection between law and rule following.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would recommend the book by Lawrence Tribe and Michael Dorff. Lawrence Tribe is a very eminent scholar of the Constitution, and by the way, a very good critic of the current Supreme Court. He wrote a book with one of his students. It's called On Reading the Constitution. He was Kripke's roommate in college. So he decided to use the idea of rule following to teach. It's a very thin book. Undergraduates can read the book. I recommend it to everyone. And it applies the rule following issues to the history of the interpretation of the Constitution, building on the idea, which we were talking about yesterday, the Constitution doesn't interpret itself, obviously. This is an anthropological, historical point. So I recommend Tribe and Dorff. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Leclerc? And then, after Professor Leclerc, I think Professor Gabriel would like to say something as well. So,
thank you, Professor Floyd, for your interesting talk, and Mauro for his comment. In the history of mathematics, some tricks have been introduced with relative success. A case in point is the introduction of imaginary numbers at the end of Renaissance by Italian mathematicians to the resolution of equations. And it works. But the square roots of negative number, it's a very strange entity here. And philosophers, intuitionists, starting with Kant, reject completely the notion of imaginary numbers because there is no intuition associated with that kind of entity. So my question is, would Wittgenstein legitimate the technique? By technique, I mean well-succeeded technique, because it's a bit redundant. A technique that is not well-succeeded should be immediately discarded. But would Wittgenstein legitimate such a technique in spite of the very strange nature of the entity involved? And maybe a sub-question would be, is there any kind of equilibrium in Wittgenstein's philosophy of mathematics between technique and intuition? So once more, thank you for your talk.
Thank you very much. There's a lot in this question. About intuition, of course, people have written about the introduction of the imaginary numbers. Andrew Pickering, an historian of science, has made a lot of that example. And it's a fascinating example. I recall, I think, that in the 1939 lectures at the beginning, when Wittgenstein discusses what he's going to be doing, he says to the students, nothing I'm doing is mathematics. What I'm doing is philosophy. I will object to certain kinds of metaphors. And then the students begin asking him questions about particular cases. I believe the imaginary numbers come up pretty quickly. And what he says is, I'm not worried about just the fact that people use the word imaginary and it's misleading. That's not what I'm doing. I'm dealing with something much deeper. So he himself brings up that particular idea. And I'm also reminded of the Tractatus, where Wittgenstein says, his remark is that if intuition, if Anschauung is needed for the resolution of mathematical problems, then language itself provides the intuition. So this would be a kind of general remark that carries through in a variety of ways to the later philosophy and the rule following, where he will say, well, if you think you need intuition to get from 1 to 2 to 3, then you need intuition to get from 0 to 0 to 0 to 0. So the point being that language itself will take care of this. So there is an answer. And of course, it's set theory far more than imaginary numbers. It's when Gauss starts bringing in actually infinite objects into math. It's the 19th century that is the place where this very abstract modern mathematics comes to be built, and it's built for a reason. It's built because Gauss wanted to bring in actually infinite objects, and you have to control the reasoning, so you actually have to do something. So this is a fairly long, but not that long, historical process. I mean, set theory is not old the way arithmetic is old, or division is old, or even the imaginary numbers is old. It's actually remarkably well mathematically articulated for something that's basically 100 years, a little more old. So I think that's worth bearing in mind when we think about the techniques as well. You had more to ask about intuition. Could there, I think, it's picking up on the idea that technique replaces method for the use of a sentence or a word, then that extrudes intuition. Here, Wittgenstein is very Frickian. He's very Russellian, too. He's not saying that there's some kind of gap. And in the final slide I gave you about recognizing the authenticity of human expressions, Wittgenstein doesn't say that some people have intuition. He would be very against that, I think, that your therapist has an intuition of, whether you're telling the truth or not. That's just mystification. What you want is to embed it in some kind of context in which reasoning or technique can be carried out. So I hope that helps. But thank you for the example.
Now, Professor Gabriel. You're muted, Professor. Okay. Oops.
Moment, just a moment. Do you understand me?
Yep.
Yes.
No. Okay, fine. Well, I want to come back to this famous passage in Grundgesetze der Arithmetik concerning the law of identity. And I think we have to distinguish three things. We have here in Frege, we have reasons to be true, and we have reasons to take something to be true, and we have causes of taking something to be true. And I found it interesting that, for instance, Dummett and Joan Weiner too accept only or identify proof and justification. And I think we have to make a distinction here. And I agree with Mauro Engelmann here that there is a transcendental argument, a transcendental pragmatic argument, that if we strive for truth, we have to accept the laws. So they are Bedingung der Möglichkeit of cognition. And I want to say that we have reasons to be true, that is logic, and reasons to take something to be true. For example, the law of identity, that is epistemology. And from epistemology, we have to distinguish psychology, which does not give reasons, but causes of taking something to be true. And I think the middle point, that is reasons to take something to be true, we have to to accept, and that is the field of epistemology in Frege. And many interpreters of Frege didn't realize that Frege accepts epistemology as well, and this is in a transcendental way a pragmatic transcendental argument, and an argument, by the way, we find exactly in the same way in Windelband. And so I want to ask you whether you accept these three parts, or do you agree with Dummett that there are only two parts, that is psychology and logic. And my argument is we have to take into account epistemology once more as handling reasons. It's a kind of justification which is not a proof. It's not a logical proof, but it is an argument. We have here reasons, epistemological reasons, which are not reasons of being true, but only to accept something to be true if we want to strive to truth. So that's my question.
Thank you very much. That's a lovely question.
Is it clear enough what I mean?
Yes, it's a lovely question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, good.
I understand quite well.
Category 2 is incredibly important, and what you say about Frege opens up many interesting questions about the role of self-evidence and various other things. But let's focus on that part 2. I see an evolution in Wittgenstein's writings. In the Tractatus, there's no such thing as reasons to take something to be true. I think in the Tractatus, Wittgenstein has bypassed this transcendental pragmatic epistemology, and that's connected with his treating the idea of logic as not even consisting of laws and not being true or false. Okay, so that's what happens in the Tractatus. But I think what happens later in uncertainty is that Wittgenstein comes to see that this second category is actually very, very important. Yeah. And so I guess I see that kind of evolution in Wittgenstein, and it hadn't occurred to me, but the anthropological perspective that Mauro and I are trying to zero in on is connected with that reasons to take something to be true. Exactly. In Wittgenstein, and I would say that uncertainty is the place where he really begins to work on that in a self-critical kind of way. So we might say that the anthropological perspective that he, let's say it could have been implicit around the edges in the Tractatus, but he pushes it more to the fore. That necessitates his coming to terms with your second category in the later philosophy. And you can already see in the later parts of philosophical investigations, some of these issues that arise in uncertainty are already being investigated. So I really appreciate the three different parts. I don't know, maybe Mauro has something he'd like to say.
No, I'm fine with that.
No. So thank you very much. This opens up, of course, as you've said, enormous debates about how to read Frege. And I must say, I'm very intimidated about how to read Frege. People always said to me that reading Wittgenstein is difficult, but I find reading Frege much more difficult because it's obvious that there will be multiple interpretations of Wittgenstein.
Yeah.
But it's not obvious that there should be multiple interpretations of Frege because it's so well structured. But of course, now we have multiple interpretations. So I feel less confident. But I thank you for that second category, which you're quite right. It is the purpose of John Weiner and so on to extrude.
Yeah, we could formulate it in this way, that we have to distinguish between justification and proof. And there are justifications which are not proofs. That is a point. And these justifications, which are not logical proofs, are of an epistemological character. That is my interpretation of Frege, and indeed is my own position too, systematical position, that we have to make this distinction between justification and proof. Do you agree with that? Okay.
Yes, I like that very much. Again, as sort of, I'm in some way a Quinian about philosophy of logic always, or maybe a Putnamian. It's kind of comes to the same thing in the attack on the analytic synthetic distinction, that you have to deal with the fact that logic is embedded already in ongoing scientific inquiry. And so what you take to be transcendentally necessary or true may be a function of the particular epistemological context in which you are in. For example, perhaps it made no sense to think of a triangle whose internal sum of its angles is greater than 180 degrees at the time of Gauss. But if you build a whole new theory of non-Euclidean geometry, then perhaps what seemed to not make sense would make sense. What might not be proved, it becomes provable. So that kind of thing is very pragmatic in the end.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else?
Thanks, Juliet, for your brilliant talk. I would like to hear more from you about the significance of Turing's 36 paper on Wittgenstein's development. I'm not sure if I understood well, but it seemed that you have suggested that Wittgenstein engaged with Turing's proof of the undecidability of first-order logic. You have mentioned the do what you do argument, but this argument appears in Turing's 36 paper in a section where he discussed where he demonstrated the unsolvability of the halting problem, right? And for the undecidability of first-order logic, it's a long way to be there. Particularly, Turing's proof of the undecidability of first-order logic presupposes, for instance, the correctness of first-order logic, and therefore it presupposes model theory, and therefore it presupposes set theory, and maybe Wittgenstein could see that as well as a hocus pocus. How do you think that? Another thing is that it's weird that Wittgenstein didn't mention in his manuscripts nothing about Turing's proof of the undecidability of first-order logic. It would be, it's difficult to argue for Wittgenstein's acceptance of Turing's proof. What do you think about it?
This is an excellent and highly informed question historically. So the impact of Wittgenstein on Turing going that direction, and I remember sitting with Mauro talking about this long ago. He said, well, the direction from from Wittgenstein to Turing, that's hard, but the direction from Turing to Wittgenstein is really hard. So I heard that, and I spent a lot of time assembling all the circumstantial evidence I have. And much of it is circumstantial, although when there's only one passage where Wittgenstein actually explicitly mentions Turing. Thank goodness he wrote that down, because otherwise my argument would have very little basis in the text. But I was in Göttingen for the year, going through Wittgenstein's manuscripts on mathematics with Felix Mohlholzer, and I'm grateful to Felix. We came to a certain passage, and I said, he must be thinking about Turing. And Felix looked at me and said, in very good German historical style, Juliet, the name Turing never appears. I said, no, I'm sure. But then I said, wait, there's one paragraph where he does actually mention Turing. So thank goodness the philological demand has been met. Now, in that particular place, Wittgenstein recapitulates exactly the specific argument of the 36 paper, which is not the halting argument. That's evidence. Not only that, the way he writes it kind of looks to me like he had it in mind. Either he had Turing's paper open in front of him, which I sort of doubt, or he remembers. So that shows some kind of impression of the particular paper on him. Now, speaking circumstantially, the decision problem was first formulated by Wittgenstein himself in a letter to Russell of 1913. So he would have had reasons to be extremely interested if Turing demonstrated this result. And I find it impossible that he was in Cambridge in the summer of 1936 and he didn't hear from someone about this incredible, giant result. That's just, given mathematical culture, given the people Wittgenstein hung out with, it seems to me transcendentally, morally impossible. He had not heard about that, and he would have been interested because that was his idea. His idea, stated to Russell, is there's only one method of determining whether something is a proposition of logic, and it has to be a rule. So now we realize that's not so. So that's by way of circumstantial evidence. Then, of course, I have to argue even more circumstantially. Why the later style? Why does he emphasize that there's no formal unity to logic? Is it really all just criticisms of the Tractatus? No, I don't think so. So it's grounded. Now, as for Turing, and is he presupposing first order logic, completeness, set theory, all these things? Sort of no. That's what's so amazing. And that's why Kleene and the other logicians doing the history of our rigorization of the notion of an algorithm, they say it's just unbelievable. Turing's analysis was regarded as self-evident immediately. It's regarded as intuitively completely correct. It doesn't matter whether you reject set theory or whether you find the means of proof used in the completeness theorem inappropriate. All of that is not to the point. So this is what I mean when I say Turing was using the method of language games. The result of the paper was anticipated by Church in 1936. So Church had found another way to prove the undecidability of first order logic. The reason that they published Turing's paper was when Max Newman first saw it, he thought that it was trivial. He didn't understand how it could be doing anything. And then they realized that it uses a completely different, it's not a pre-existing blueprint for an argument. It's very, very different. So I think that must have impacted on Wittgenstein. They certainly talked in the summer of 37 about undecidability results, and I take Watson's paper in mind to encapsulate that. And it's echoed in Wittgenstein's manuscripts when he goes off to Norway that summer of 38. So there's a lot of circumstantial evidence, given the amount of time I've spent reading Wittgenstein. It's not an accident. Now, at best, I have given you circumstantial reasons. I don't have a remark where he says, oh, it was reading Turing's paper that got me to do these things. But it all kind of fits together conceptually if we think about the nature of logic. And I just don't think it's an accident that Turing's actual argument, which is not the halting argument, ends on the question of following a rule, a tautological command. And independently, there's a remark Kreisel made in one of his early 1950s papers, trying to present the incompleteness results. And he has a little footnote where he says, the idea of this proof as write what you write, I got from Wittgenstein. So Wittgenstein was talking to Kreisel about it. Again, write what you write is sort of one of like the do what you do machine. So there's some evidence there. Anyway, it fits together beautifully, and no one else has a story. So until someone else has a different story, my circumstantial evidence, I'm just going to take to be clear, because history is a history of just so stories in Kipling's sense anyway. So this is my just so story. Thank you.
Okay. So I think that we can. Is that okay? No, it's okay. Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So thank you so very much, Professor Juliet and Mauro and Professor Gabriel, and thank you. And we come back at 2 p.m. for our afternoon sessions. And thank you so very much.
Thank you all very much.
For professors and everybody which is accompanying us, we are going straight forward to the restaurant. Okay.
It wasn't clear what I said about
Vamos pedir para a Julia
Yeah, we can talk about that. No, I know there's a
a
point.
palestra
I
dele,
know it's part of
o
the,
comentário e a
yeah, but
resposta
it's part
dele.
of the initial point. It's part of the
Eu vou fazer isso agora.
I have to kind of formulate it better. And also, it was much better hearing you talk it.
Okay.
When you talk it, then